so much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amy Volkins. I am the Strategic Account Executive for Federal Climate Research and a representative of our Center for Climate Solutions from RTI International. RTI is a nonprofit applied research institute dedicated to improving the human condition by turning knowledge into practice. We're here today with this panel to discuss how government investments are transforming the landscape of climate-resilient infrastructure. Since 2022, the United States government has been making historic investments to advance equitable and climate-resilient infrastructure. Through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the U.S. government will invest $110 billion in new funding for transportation, broadband, climate, energy, and the environment. We are also 1 year into historic investments funded under the Inflation Reduction Act, which is making the largest ever investment in clean energy and climate action to help the United States meet its climate goals while also strengthening energy security and the economy. The Biden administration has already invested more than $1 billion to help communities become more resilient and protected from the worst impacts of climate change, including impacts from heat, drought, and extreme weather. We have an esteemed panel of guests with us today to discuss these investments and how they are transforming the landscape of climate-resilient infrastructure, so let's get to it. Our first panelist is Dr. Rick Spinrad, Undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere, as well as the NOAA Administrator. Dr. Spinrad is responsible for the strategic direction and oversight of NOAA and its 12,000 employees, including developing NOAA's portfolio of products and services to address the climate crisis, enhance environmental sustainability, foster economic development, and create a more just, equitable, diverse, and inclusive workforce. Prior to his appointment, Dr. Spinrad served as a professor of oceanography and senior advisor to the Vice President of Research at Oregon State University. While serving in a leadership role at the U.S. Office of Naval Research, an oceanographer of the Navy, Dr. Spinrad was awarded the Distinguished Civilian Service Award, the highest award given by the U.S. Navy to a civilian. He is also the recipient of Presidential Rank Awards from Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama. So Dr. Spinrad, first question to you. I've given a very quick overview of the historic investments the U.S. government is making. How are these investments helping NOAA ensure that the U.S. is a climate-ready nation equipped with climate-resilient infrastructure?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Amy. And as you were setting this conversation up, I got to thinking, I was confirmed on June 21st, 2021, on the basis of my argument that our agency, NOAA, had three very important things to do, one of which was to establish an important leadership sustained role around climate intelligence and actually building a climate-ready nation. Another was demonstrating that we can balance environmental stewardship and economic development at the same time. And the third was a portfolio of equity, both in terms of delivery of products and services and in terms of our own workforce. And at the time, I thought this makes a really compelling argument, but I have no idea how we're going to get the resources to do this. That was 2021. Shortly thereafter, as you so well described, a passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, which in the case of NOAA translated to over $6 billion of new money. I should also point out, I started my career in the Reagan administration at the Office of Naval Research, where the first thing I was told was, in the federal government, young man, there is no new money. Well, this is new money. This is money we've never seen before. It's over and above the core investments we've got. So at the heart of your question was part of the answer. That is, we are going to use these resources to establish and build a climate-ready nation, including our infrastructure, including our workforce, including our capacity to adapt to climate change. So in that regard, we've done a number of things with these resources to get to that goal. We've invested in climate science, we've invested in services we've invested in climate resilience in communities. And in fact, just recently, we announced a competitive grant program using over $500 million of the bipartisan infrastructure law money and the IRA money for a climate resilience regional challenge. That's the good news. The point I think this audience should be aware of is that $575 million competition resulted in $16 billion worth of really good proposals coming in. So there is a demand signal for this kind of work. The interest in this activity has been through the roof. And quite honestly, it's, I think, a reflection of the fact that we can't treat this as a one and done. We've got to sustain these kinds of investments. What are we doing with these resources? We're doing things like building out coastal habitats. We're building out resilient infrastructure in terms of bridges, culverts. We're restoring wetlands to ensure that we're also reducing coastal flooding at the same time. But it's not just coastal flooding. We're investing in improving our flood inundation mapping. We're also supporting the National Integrated Drought Information System. Probably the best way to think about what we're doing is in terms of the hazards: drought, wildfire, flood, coastal resilience, extreme heat. That's where the resources are going. And to do that, we've got to engage in an effort with communities to understand what the infrastructure requirements are. Part of that is building a set of foundational products and services. So one of which I think you're going to hear about a few times here today is the Atlas of Precipitation and Extreme Precipitation. The Atlas 14, as we call it, the Precipitation Atlas, is outdated. So we're using some of these BIL and IRA resources to build Atlas 15, the updated atlas that provides critical information on extreme precipitation to support exactly flood mitigation efforts. Another part of this is the recognition that we're climate scientists. We understand the environment, we understand the predictability, the information that we need to improve predictability. We are not engineers. And so one of the very early things we did was we said, well, part of the solution here in infrastructure is in being able to influence things like building codes. How do we do that? And the answer, of course, is by engaging with groups like the American Society of Civil Engineers. ASCE is the organization that does, with regularity and precision and established authority, provide to the nation those standards upon which building codes are made. And they turned to us and they said, okay, we need to understand how things are going to change. Most of our standards for civil engineering are based on assumptions of a stationary climate, and we know it ain't stationary. So we established an agreement with ASCE, a formal agreement, and recognized that by taking advantage of our climate prediction capabilities, we can help them understand how to lean forward in establishing building code standards so that they're not predicating those on the current climate, but what the best, most skillful models are telling us the climate's going to look like in the near future. And so that particular partnership, based on understanding of how temperatures will change, precipitation will change, coastal flooding will change, sea level rise will change, has turned out to be probably one of the most important elements of what we're doing with the BIL and IRA funds. So to kind of wrap it up, it's about on-the-ground investments in terms of the engineering associated with restoring habitats, making coasts more resilient. It's also about building products that people can understand. So part of our effort is engaging with experts in geographic information systems like Esri to say, how do we put this out in a way that a community planner can understand what's going to happen 20, 30, 40 years in terms of extreme heat days that I'm going to see in my neighborhood. And capacity building is part of this as well, so working with local communities through our on-the-ground resources. And the final piece, I'll say, is in building the workforce. So we're investing $60 million in building what we're calling a climate-ready workforce, part of the Climate Corps, the American Climate Corps, so that 20 years from now, there are people there who will understand what a climate resilience toolkit is and how to use it to make decisions about infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that flattering answer, as you are surrounded by 3 engineers. So just tell us what to do and we shall do it for you. Thank you so much. Our second panelist is Dr. Hassan Mahmood, the George T. Abel Professor in Infrastructure in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Colorado State University. Dr. Mahmood's research focuses on sustainable and resilient infrastructure and communities, emphasizing developing socio-physical models to capture the recovery of systems as influenced by human behavior and socioeconomic policies. He is an international authority on infrastructure and community resilience and an advisor to the World Bank, insurance companies, and other agencies. Dr. Mahmood has chaired and served on numerous technical committees, including the ASCE Committees on Fire Protection and Multi-Hazard Mitigation. Dr. Mahmood is a fellow of the Structural Engineering Institute and is the recipient of multiple awards. So Hassam, question for you. You study community resilience with a focus on the recovery of social institutions and critical infrastructure following extreme events. What investments and advances are you seeing that are helping communities to better withstand the impacts of climate change or to rebound more quickly from natural disasters?
Well, thanks, Amy, for the introduction and the kind invitation to be part of this esteemed panel. So your question kind of has two pieces to it. What advances has been made to sort of lessen the impact and recover? From an impact perspective, there's a lot of, Rick mentioned a lot of really wonderful sort of remarks on what measures some communities are taking to strengthen the built environment against extreme events. I mean, flooding and bridges is somewhat very well understood. You know how you can actually prevent bridges from washing away, for example. Scour issue is a problem, but it's well understood. The people have been working on this for a while, and so there's a lot of efforts that are put in place to strengthen the built environment. There are certain cases where we're doing that, but we're not necessarily sure how to do it well. For example, wildfire is a big problem in the US and many other countries. Believe it or not, until only very recently, we don't have a single model anywhere in the entire world that can tell you which building will survive versus burn in a wildfire event. And if you don't know how fire will burn through a community, how could you then come up with mitigations, right? The only way you come up with mitigations is to understand how things will develop over time. And so, the good thing about wildfire in particular, since I mentioned, is that there has been some effort we're doing at CSU on this, and many communities and insurance companies are jumping on board. There's a lot of investments from philanthropies and the government in terms of looking at wildfires. And I'll tell you overall my summary and understanding of how the built environment behaves in extreme events is that we understand seismic impact on the built environment relatively very well. Other natural hazards are much less understood. Take sea level rise coupled with storm surge. We have very little knowledge. We've analyzed only a handful of archetypical buildings, and there's a lot we don't know. So there's a lot to invent and invest in understanding the behavior, and Rick mentioned the collaboration with ACE. Now, on the recovery, I hate to tell you this, but there's hardly any work that has been done so far. There are some efforts that are being put forward by government agencies. NEST, for example, established these guidelines, or a very nice report summarizing the idea of what they call functional recovery. How can we get buildings to recover fast? Civil infrastructures are designed for life safety, not for recovery. So the whole idea of designing, or the philosophy and design codes, was always make sure people don't die, right? But that doesn't work anymore. We want to make sure that people are safe, but we want to recover really quick. Well, how do we do that? We don't know. There are no guidelines to do that. There are no tools that allows us to do that. There are things that are being developed. And when we talk about physical recovery, it's relatively easier because it's all about fixing the building, right? But when we talk about critical infrastructure, like hospitals, for example, it's much more complicated because not only that you need to cover the hospital as a physical structure, but you need all interdependent infrastructure systems, water and power and so on. You actually need to have staff and doctors and physicians and supply and food and oxygen. So there are tools that are being developed on this, very little. We're fortunate to be one of the groups developing this, and that's why the World Bank That's why we're working with the World Bank on this. But there's a lot more need to be done. And communities are not at a point yet where they're using these tools to make decisions on recovery. I feel like we're not entirely there yet. A lot needs to be done, but I think we will get there because I think there is a clear path how to get there.
There's a lot we could dig in there about working with the healthcare sector and the systemic kind of repercussions that can propagate. So I hope we can dive into some of that in the Q&A.
Absolutely.
Okay, our third panelist is Michael Kane, Director of the Center for Water Resources at RTI International. The Center for Water Resources addresses 4 facets of water resources management, including river forecasting and reservoir operations, river basin and water supply modeling, hydrometeorology and precipitation frequency estimates, and hydrologic risk from floods and droughts. The center's work is applied in a planning mode or in real-time operations to protect life and property, generate renewable energy, safeguard the environment, and ensure climate-resilient systems and infrastructure. Mr. Kane specializes in the development and implementation of real-time river forecasting and decision support for water resources systems. These projects involve developing systems that our clients use every day to make the best decisions about managing their water resource systems. He has delivered these systems throughout the United States and abroad in countries such as India, Panama, El Salvador, Mexico, South Africa, Vietnam, and Uzbekistan. So, Michael, question for you. Your center is doing this work for NOAA and other U.S. federal agencies that help manage water resources. What investments and advances are you seeing that will have a meaningful impact on the ability of water systems and infrastructure to withstand the impacts of climate change?
Okay, thanks, Amy. And as you mentioned, all the things that we do and the work we're doing for NOAA, I should thank Dr. Spinrad because we're a benefit of a lot of the funds that come from NOAA, specifically things like Atlas 14, which people on my staff are developing right now. It's good to have Water Day here at COP. And I've been hearing in several talks today, climate problem is a water problem. And as you mentioned, storms and severe storms and floods, prolonged droughts and things. And it's all around the infrastructure. So getting back to your point on investments in infrastructure, infrastructure is built with the climate in mind, but it's operated on the weather. I'll get to the weather in a second, but the investments we're seeing in the infrastructure design happen to do with Atlas 14 and 15. And to go into that a little bit more detail, why does it matter? What is Atlas 14? I get that all the time. So engineers in the built environment, they must design a culvert under a road. How big does that culvert need to be? Well, if you go to the state rules, often it says go to Atlas 14 and see what the 10-year precipitation is, and then build your culvert to be able to handle that. And that's in, I think it's in all 50 states. The code says go to Atlas 14. And then if you want to build a dam, I don't think anybody's doing that much anymore, but the damages would be a bit more consequential. You want to look at maybe a 1,000-year event or a 10,000-year event because you don't want certainly don't want any problems there. Where do you get those numbers? You get it from Atlas 14, which are maps of the United States that show precipitation frequency all over the place. Atlas 14 was, I think, started to get put together in the 90s. And we built it by examining the historical record, looking at the last 30 to 50 years of precipitation and analyzing that statistically and coming up with what's the return period on all these events. As you know, if we built one of these maps in 2003, it's now 20 years old and the climate's very different now. So we need to update Atlas 14. And another thing, and I don't know how you guys did this, but you would only put out a new map if a state reimbursed you to build the map. You didn't have your own funds to build it. Well, now you do. And so we're helping the outstanding staff at NOAA redo the entire country at one time. And that's a great investment in the infrastructure. Now, it's not going to help much for the infrastructure that's already built. So I'll get into how we handle that too. I mentioned infrastructure is built for the climate, but it's operated for the weather. So there's a great investment from NOAA in the Cooperative Institute for Research to Operations, CAIRO. RTI is a part of that as well. Because if the infrastructure is already there, it's operated for the weather, we need better short-term forecasts in order to be able to make sure that infrastructure is going to be safe. There are a lot of things going on in Cairo, including part of it is looking at new science for Atlas 14, looking at new science for Atlas 15, which includes climate change in those precipitation frequencies. But we're also looking at just basic hydrologic science to be able to improve the forecasts. We're looking at social science to be able to help people understand what do these forecasts mean, what do you need to do, what format should it be in so you can react appropriately. Outside of NOAA, we're already seeing investments in forecasts for reservoirs. The Corps of Engineers is interested in FIRO, F-I-R-O, which is Forecast Informed Reservoir Operations. How do you live with the uncertainty of a forecast when you need to operate a reservoir right now and not increase the risk of what's going on? So there's a lot of science going on now to understand how to change operating rules in a reservoir. When do I let out water? When do I keep it in there? All the while trying to generate hydropower electricity and provide irrigation water for farmers and drinking water for the cities. How do I manage all of that under forecast conditions, which are highly uncertain? That's something the Corps of Engineers is looking at with FIRO. Not within the federal realm, but other power companies, they're also investing in forecast systems very similar to what the National Weather Service uses under NOAA when they put out their river forecasts. It's hard to believe, but within the last 20 years, we've probably put in a dozen or more forecasting systems for power companies. And when we talk to them, how have you been forecasting now? They have a guy who knows that if I'm watching the radar and I see it's rained that much over that part of the basin and that gauge gets half an inch of rain, I know my reservoir is going to go up by 6 inches and I need to take these actions. And that's how it's been operating for years, and it's been operating very successfully. That guy's about to retire. They need us, and his knowledge has not been passed on. For one thing, the climate is changing and the short-term weather is becoming more severe, so his rules may not apply anymore. So power companies are now investing in forecasting systems very similar to the ones that the Weather Service uses, just on a slightly smaller scale. And I think that's a good thing, too. It's good for RTI and the rest of the country.
You've touched on a few things there. I mean, we're building infrastructure that's meant to last into the future as the climate is changing. And you've touched on like a fundamental issue that I struggle with when it comes to climate change, which is we have to make decisions in the face of uncertainty, and those decisions can affect life and property. And those are some high stakes decisions that we're making. Okay. Given that time and money are always limited, what do you see as the top priorities for continued investments in climate resilient infrastructure in the U.S.? Dr. Spinrad, would you go first?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm going to come back to this sort of biblical framing, if you will, of the hazards of heat, drought, flood, and in this case, I'll also include wildfires, because Hassan mentioned that, and I think there's an important component there. So I'll call that three, since it's heat, water, and wildfire. But on the water side, it's really about drought and flood. Let me start with the heat, and specifically heat health. This is perhaps the most insidious health problem we've got tied to climate, since extreme heat really disproportionately affects our nation's underserved communities, and it is one of the major causes of weather-related deaths, and it's predictable. We now have the skill set to be able to downscale some of the models to the point where we're not just simply saying, hey, it's going to be a hot day in Dubai, but we can actually start saying, in this neighborhood, it's going to be 10 degrees warmer than in that neighborhood for 6 more hours. So that's a really important element. And of course, the extremes of heat are going to become even greater under a climate change scenario. In the U.S., we've begun a program called the National Integrated Heat Health Information System, which is based on the concepts we developed for the National Integrated Drought Information System. But in this case, we're working with a different set of federal partners, including the Centers for Disease Control and National Institutes of Health. The other thing we're doing is we're going to develop a national heat strategy. We've not had one before, and that's something we've highlighted here at COP28 as one of the deliverables. Let me get to the drought and flood piece, and I really want to build on Michael's comment because I love that you brought up the FIRO, the Forecast-Informed Reservoir Operations. I first got engaged in some of those activities many years ago when we discovered atmospheric rivers on the west coast of the United States. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, these are these very dramatic extreme precipitation events that actually, we used to call them Pineapple Express, because when you look at the satellite image, it is a clear river of precipitation, usually coming from around the Hawaiian Islands. These account for about 70% of the precipitation overall, but they are very episodic. It may be 2 or 3 days of up to 10 inches of rain in an area, and they vary dramatically geographically. So your forecast has to be spot on, because if you get it wrong by 20 or 30 miles, you go from a prediction of, say, 3 inches of rain in 3 days to no rain. Or the other way, you could miss the forecast. And these obviously are critical to reservoir operations, because if they can nail the forecast, they know how much to store, how much to release. The dynamics of atmospheric rivers are getting better understood, but what we don't know is the climate impact on atmospheric rivers. Are they going to become more severe? Are their transits and their sort of dynamics going to change fundamentally? So for me, that's one of the real big challenges, and that's both a flood and a drought issue. And let me just say a couple of words on the wildfire piece, and I will share with you, I have a very personal example of this one. So before I came back to DC for this job, I was living in a home on the high desert of Oregon. I had 13 acres of property surrounded by public lands, and it became very clear that as compared to when I bought the property 20 years earlier, we were going to have wildfire on my property. It had juniper trees, it had sagebrush. I had to make a decision to remove all that fuel. I made that decision because I knew the state climatologist, I knew where to go to get the best NOAA data, and it made sense to me to undertake that effort. I remember my neighbors said to me, "Why are you doing that? That seems crazy." And then shortly thereafter, when they saw that I was doing it, they saw the threat of wildfire, where there had not been a threat before, they all asked me for the name of the guy who did the work to clear the property. So I bring that up as a very personal example, and I think it exemplifies the issue that in wildfire, obviously, we have to be able to improve our forecast at very fine scales, not just in terms of the probability of wildfire, but also in terms of what's happening during the fire, because there's microclimates in the wildfire itself, and then what are the downstream consequences? Because wherever you have wildfire, you also have burn scars, so now all of a sudden you're more prone to flooding when that atmospheric river comes by. So in a climate sense, being able to predict how the fuel load is going to change due to vegetation changing, how the temperatures are going to change, what's the behavior of severe lightning storms going to be like 10, 20 years from now, and then what are the mitigating actions that you can take to deal with that. So I would say the most important things really are tied to those risks associated with heat, associated with water, both too much and too little, and associated with wildfires.
I got chills when you told that story because I had a very similar experience. My parents bought property in northern Michigan in 1970. My parents and my grandparents built the house. It was 2 acres on a spring-fed trout river. And, Michigan, so wet, just so moist, so many trees right in the woods. They had a wildfire about 10 years ago, might be a little bit longer now, that came within miles of their property, and then they did some defensible space work. And isn't that like a core thing too? You have to see the impacts locally. You have to feel the impacts yourself before many people are motivated to take action. So I think that's very powerful.
Look at Lahaina in Maui, another example where people were not thinking about that. Now they are. It's too late to think about it.
Absolutely. Michael, is there anything you want to add to that question about where to put continued investments in climate resilient infrastructure?
Sure. I talked about infrastructure was designed for a different climate, and so I want to talk about the big infrastructure, the dams. There are over 100,000 dams in the United States, and they were built for a different climate than we have now. We don't know which ones might be the most vulnerable to a severe event. And how do you, doing a complete dam risk analysis can take I don't know, 9 months and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. We don't have time or money to do that for 100,000 dams. So we did a project with the World Bank in India to develop a screening tool to do a quick hydrologic risk analysis of dams, automated across a good chunk of India. We did 400 dams there. And it doesn't tell us which one is what's going to happen at each one necessarily, but it does give us a relative scale of this one is at a much higher risk of problems than this one. So then spend your money on this one, doing a detailed analysis and figure things out. So I think what we need to do is that we know there's a lot of risks out there. We need tools like that to figure out what our priorities should be. That's our top priority, to figure out our priorities.
But kind of quick and dirty, and make sure that you're investing the resources in the things that have the most risk and likely to have the most impact to the environment and to humans. Exactly. Yeah, I love that. Okay, moving on to the next question. What are some of the critical gaps in our knowledge or implementation that you have observed that reduce our ability to build climate resilient systems in the U.S.? And how can we better address these gaps? Hussam, would you go first?
Yeah, this question I could spend hours and hours trying to answer. So I'll try to break it down. You know, in terms of so damage to the built environment usually has the biggest impact on resilience of communities. If I put a number on it, I'd say 80%. If you have robust infrastructure, then you should be in good shape in general. Now, how do we achieve that point? We have to invest in upgrading the infrastructure with knowledge that we know that works. And so the wildfire question then comes up again. Like, for example, we developed a model that allows us now to understand which building will burn, which building will survive. But we're finding out something really important. In order for you to protect communities, you have to actually understand how each house is impacted by the neighboring house and the one after it and the one down the road, and so it becomes a network problem. We're finding, for example, that in order for you to protect homes, you actually have to have a minimum number of mitigation within a community. So if I fix my home and nobody else fixes their home, I've spent, money is wasted, right? So there's a threshold for every community it's different, because every community has its own characteristics. So there's a minimum number of homes that you have to upgrade in a specific location, coupled with certain fuel reduction in a specific location for you to reduce the risk at a level that you want to reduce it. And we need to understand that things work this way. We have to think outside of the box and think of how to apply these mitigation strategies in the way that actually makes it work. From a design perspective, I also put a lot of I put a lot of responsibility on engineers. Engineers, civil engineers design with the idea of initial cost. That's what drives the design decision. But we have to think of things down the line of how the life cycle cost will impact the entire cost for that infrastructure. We've done some work to look, for example, at Mobile, Alabama, how sea level rise impacts foundation in terms of saltwater intrusion, because the sea level rise causes saltwater intrusion, which mixes with groundwater, and that hits the foundation from the bottom. These concrete foundations are typically cracked, which is fine. They're designed to crack. And then that salt water now makes its way inside the concrete, and now we have corroded reinforcements. Now, what I just explained is not a mysterious, strange story for someone to think about. I am 100% sure that other people thought about it. Why wasn't anybody out there doing this type of analysis? I don't know. Why is it that we don't include it in our design? I don't know either. But we have to think outside of the box. We have to invest in understanding the behavior more, understanding the impact of our mitigations much more to minimize damage. Now, from a recovery perspective, because you mentioned this quick question also earlier, we're doing a lot of work on healthcare system. Healthcare has to be viewed from a system of systems perspective. In order for us to be able to have, social institutions, which, education systems or healthcare system, we have to understand how they work as an entity and how they work in a network. So, for example, you have to understand the probability of a patient going to this hospital, and patient transfer from one hospital to another based on hospital agreements, the probability of staff working overtime, what's the likelihood of the staff being able to get to the hospital, which requires us to understand the transportation network functionality. Do we have backup system, backup water, power, and so on? So I acknowledge that it's very complicated. But I also argue that we need to embrace this complexity in order for us to develop solutions that actually work, as opposed to look at it from a much, much higher elevation and dump a lot of money in things that will work to some extent, but it won't be optimal solution. Given the challenges that we have, which is, we have enormous amount of challenges, I don't think we can afford to do that. Right? And the wildfire example is one of them. If I implement mitigation for every single home in my community, that's the best you could do. And it might not save the community at the end of the day either, right? But you've dumped a lot of money that might have not been necessary to dump into the community. So we need to work more on developing these advanced models for assessment of damage, advanced simulations for recovery, and use these to work the problem backwards to determine what would be the best solutions to enhance community resilience.
I'm struck that so many of the examples that you all are providing are about kind of bridging the gap between natural systems where we have uncertainty alone about what's going to happen in the future, but then bringing it into the built environment, and that just kind of exacerbates the uncertainty. That's something I'm really noting in the remarks that you're making. Dr. Spinrad, what's your perspective on the gaps that you are seeing?
The gaps take a couple of different flavors. I mean, the first one that comes to mind always for me is our observational gap. We are a data deplete community. We simply do not have enough of the observations we need to improve the models, to improve the quality of the information we've got. I mean, when you think about it, for example, right now in terms of our ability to observe the ocean, which is the source of a lot of the driver for a lot of the weather systems that we're looking at, we have a series of floats. We have about 4,000 floats called Argo floats out there. You think, well, 4,000, that's pretty good. Well, the ocean's really large. And so to give you a sense of the sort of spatial distribution on average, if these 4,000 floats were evenly distributed around the globe, they would be about the equivalent of one for every state in the United States. I can tell you that's not sufficient data density to really improve the quality of our models. And then you talk about remote sensing. We simply don't have the diversity and the sustained investment in things. It's interesting, we're here at COP where methane and greenhouse gas observations are front and center. And yet, when you talk about a remotely sensed capability for making methane observations, you can count on one hand the number of reliable systems out there that are going to be able to make remotely sensed observations of methane. So I would say observations is one of the first things. The second thing I would say is a much more specific example, and it's the example of flood inundation mapping. That we've all actually alluded to that a little bit in some of our comments here, but recognizing that for things like hurricanes, the killer is not the wind storm, the killer is the water. And so whether it's the storm surge consequences or whether it's when some people used to call sunny day flooding, you look at Norfolk, Virginia, where now the number of sunny day flooding events, that is to say a high tide in combination with a wind event in combination with sea level rise where you get flooding of the downtown area, it's now about 4 or 5 times as frequent as it used to be just a few years ago. Our ability to map that and make those predictions is going to be of enormous value for those who are involved in infrastructure development. And in fact, Norfolk is a really good example because they put in a light rail system without the benefit of that understanding, and now a lot of times that light rail is useless. Had they really had the foresight back then, we didn't have the tools at that point, but had they had the flood inundation mapping at hand, they probably would have been able to make a much wiser infrastructure investment for that particular transportation infrastructure.
Thank you so much. So now I'd like to talk about the next steps that you all feel are imperative for the U.S. government, private industry, or other stakeholders to take to ensure that we continue building climate resilient systems. So Michael, would you take this one first?
Okay. So I came here to COP as a scientist and an engineer, so my first response would be, we need to keep funding to improve the science. And after listening to all the talks at COP here, yeah, of course we need to do that. But we also need to start, climate change is happening right now as far as the water is concerned, the hydrology, the hydrologic systems. We need to start building up the more resilient systems as they exist now, and not wait and see if we can get to 1.5 degrees a change in the temperature. No, things are happening now. We need to be more resilient with them, and it's going to take. We need to be doing everything all at once. Essentially, we need to be yes, improving the infrastructure, taking care of the risks there. We need to be doing nature-based solutions, absolutely, in more places. We need to be we need to handle the social science side of this. We need to be looking at economic impacts so we can see where are our priorities. We need to be looking at underserved communities and where do we help them the most. So next steps, we do it all.
Just do it all. Okay, Dr. Spinrad, what's your opinion?
Ditto. Yeah, the trouble is there's an old saying that if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. Yeah. So this is a tough question. I think the answer depends on the audience, depends on who you're talking about. But I would say at the heart of it is invest. This area is something I love coming to COP because I know I've got a friendly audience when I talk about this. But when I go talk to Congress, when I go talk to the business community, it's not as clear that the investment is a high priority for many of them. And so to the extent we can build a culture that understands the investment is going to pay off, I mean, that's what the concept of investment is. You're not sinking resources, you are actually getting a return on that investment. I believe strongly in building out what I call the climate industrial complex. And I use that term having come out of DoD, where everybody knows about the military industrial complex, this massive sort of engine that supports development, supports a mission. In that case, it was a national security mission. We need a similar climate industrial complex involving the public sector, the private sector, academia, philanthropy that is churning away with that investment to put out new products and services. And I would say the third key element is the workforce. We make the assumption that the next generation understands how to use these rather sophisticated tools, these models, these data that we are creating, and that may not necessarily be true. That we need a workforce that knows how to make trade-off decisions, especially in the area of infrastructure, climate resilient infrastructure, to know where do I decide, when do I decide? Let's use that Norfolk example that maybe we actually should not put a light rail system in. Maybe the answer is to come up with some other transportation solution. You're going to get that if you've got somebody who understands climate and what the changes are going to look like down the line.
Mm-hmm. And Hussam, what about you? What next steps do you think are most imperative and by whom?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, we talked a little bit about the impact on the built environment and the impact on the recovery and so on. And I think, just to echo some of the stuff that was said, but I think we need to do more of implementation, but also continue the development of tools and the science behind some of these things that we were trying to address. But I also think there should be a much stronger push from the government in terms of community engagement. Develop many mechanisms that allow scientists to engage with communities. Because if I have a tool that I believe very strongly and I can show that it works and something is happening, right? It's developing something, it's allowing us to make decision in a completely new way. I need to find an easy mechanism to work with communities, right? I reach out to somebody, people are very busy in their jobs, right? Community leaders and so on. Maybe they reply, maybe they don't reply. We need much more sort of a streamlined way to connect much easier, to work with them much easier, to come up with these solutions and to implement them. There are some grants and there are some mechanisms, but in my opinion, they're absolutely, they're good, but they're insufficient given the problem that we're dealing with. Of course, there's a lot of stuff that we need to do. When I talked about impact on the built environment and recovery and so on, there's bazillion things that have to be done in terms of data availability. Also, how do you get all this data, right? Which is another big problem to feed into the models and so on. So I'm not talking about the challenges associated with building these models, but if I have something that works, I need to, implement it with communities, and I need a much better mechanism to do that than we currently have.
People and sustained investments.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to open it up to the audience. If anybody has a question they'd like to ask the panelists, we can do that now.
Yeah. Thank you for that really interesting talk. Dr. Spinrad talked about gaps in observational data, and Mr. Kane talked about industries investing in getting more sensor data, sort of improving where there are gaps. I'm wondering if you all can talk a little bit about to what degree government and private sector are working together to share data, given that there are limited resources. Seems like a good opportunity, and so if you all could share, what you're experiencing there.
I'd be glad to take a first shot. The government is slowly recognizing that we don't all own all the toys. And I say that tongue-in-cheek, but by the same token, historically, in the environmental arena, the government really did have most of the responsibility. We're seeing a really interesting development of data as a service. And so there are some very creative companies out there. Saildrone is an example. And we have now developed both formal contractual relationships as well as cooperative R&D agreements that have no cost on our end to establish mechanisms for continued delivery or purchase of data from the private sector to our specifications or our needs, and at the same time define new capabilities. Saildrone, again, is a good example because that's a whole new kind of concept of operations, autonomous observing system. So it's exciting because it offers a whole new area for getting more data, quality data. The however in that statement is that we need to be assured of sustainability in that data stream. And so there's some risk on our part in saying, okay, we'll start buying those data, but 5 years from now, if the company decides to go make cookies instead of environmental data, are we going to be left high and dry? But I think there's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy in that too. If the government is the market, we can help assure the sustainability of that. So it's an exciting new area. I think 10 years from now, if you were to ask that question, we'd be in a mode, we the government, and I don't just mean NOAA, I think I'm speaking for all of my government partners, where we are actually using the private sector's data collection capabilities as a standard part of our concept of operations.
And I'll add there, citizen science is a way that we're approaching this as well. There's a network of rain gauges out there called CocoRAS, which actually started in Fort Collins, Colorado, where I'm based, after a flood in 1997. It's Colorado Cooperative Rain, Hail, and Snow something. I think that's what's in the system. Yeah. But there are thousands of CocoRAS gauges all over the United States now, and they're in schools, at the roofs of schools, where students can learn about taking a gauge. There are standards. They have to get a standard gauge. They have to follow standard procedures, and they input it into a web-based system. I don't think those numbers are going into the weather prediction models, but they are useful for verification of things or checking for extreme precipitation information. And I think that's one way we can close the gap a little bit with some citizen science there.
Can I make one other comment, and that is that the other aspect of this is the risk mitigation. So a very specific example is there's a technology called radio occultation, wherein basically you look at how satellite data are being transmitted, and as the satellite is orbiting, it's actually transmitting through different layers of the atmosphere. And if you look at the difference in the signal, you can derive information about the vertical profile of things like humidity in the atmosphere, water content. That's a kind of a risky concept for us, but there are companies out there that are saying, we will develop that technology and sell the data to you as part of your operations. And our attitude is, great, let's start looking into that. So now we are on a daily basis collecting literally thousands of vertical profiles of atmospheric humidity using this relationship with the private sector.
We need a lot of data for some of the stuff that we obviously were doing. It's been a struggle in some cases. I don't know to what extent is the private sector working with governments on data, collection and so on. But I can tell you, for example, we've done some work on food security following earthquakes for a community in California. We couldn't find any data online. We reached out to a private company that had all the data. How did they get the data? I have no clue, but we had to buy it from them, right? So that was one mechanism for us. We were doing a lot of work with the World Bank, looking at, for example, Peru, Nepal, Colombia. And it's wonderful because I don't have to worry about anything. They're getting me all the data from the governments, and the governments are the ones that are pushing for this work, right? So we're doing work on healthcare resilience in Colombia, and we had a meeting with the Minister of Health, and he's champion of what we're planning on doing. He got us all the data. We don't have to worry about it. California is a perfect example of not that they have every single data you want, but they're really keeping good track of data. They're very open to sharing the data and so on. So some areas are different than others. But the issue with standardized data becomes a problem, because if we're collecting data from different locations, it doesn't fit what the model wants. So we have to go and update the model again and again and again, and it's a waste of time, of course. So there's a lot of issues related to data that I think needs to be addressed. But we're not data deprived, but we're not also at a point. I agree, with the comment that we will get there, but still there are ways to go.
Thank you. Amy cited at the beginning of the session the successes of and the once-in-a-generation investments in the IRA and the bill. I'm curious, another success of the administration has been working equity into what's being worked on, and in this case, environmental justice. Can you talk about how these massive investments are in resilient infrastructure particularly can benefit communities that are being disproportionately impacted or otherwise historically ignored? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'll answer first. Is we're doing this also by direction, because the Justice 40 directive out of the White House directed that 40% of the benefit of these investments go to those vulnerable, underserved, or unserved communities. So we are being held accountable to make sure those investments are going there. How is it playing out? In NOAA's case, we saw this coming, so we undertook a series of pilots. First, we started doing roundtables around the community, around the country. We did eight of these roundtables with on targeted problems. Like in the Southwest, it was around heat health, and so we brought in people to talk about where are the vulnerable communities, underserved communities. In Alaska, it was with many of the native tribes. In the Southwest, it was with a number of migrant communities as well, and also working with faith-based communities to see what their issues are. So it positioned us well to know where are there some targets of opportunity, if you will, as we got the BIL and IRA programs to build projects. So heat health is one area where that is really tuned to the needs. In the urban environments around the U.S., the ones that are most vulnerable to heat health impacts tend to be the impoverished communities, the underserved communities. So we're making very specific investments, and oftentimes it's kind of ironic that those investments do not need to be very large. A few $1 million is making a dramatic impact in the ability of that community to be prepared for a major heat event, for example.
I will, maybe offer a perspective. This is a great question. I think we've been looking at this from an equity and justice perspective, which is absolutely should be the core foundation. But everybody has to buy into this. And in my opinion, one of the most important things to reflect on is the fact that these marginalized communities that have workers that end up working at factories and maybe agricultural land, they actually form the core foundation for the economy for this area. So it is to everybody's interest, not only to their interest, not just their interest, it's the interest of the middle class and the higher class, for these people to have their homes and have their jobs and have everything. Otherwise, the entire community, right, collapses. So we have to look at it. I know there's always that distinction between, financial, making decision based on financial, value or economics versus social aspect of it. But I feel like in this case, they shouldn't even be separated. Justice is number one, but it's also important for everybody, even the rich that live in that community. And again, I go back to the idea of investing in the right way, understanding what are the vulnerabilities, what do they look like, because it's not always clear. From a civil engineering perspective and designing civil infrastructure, I'll give you one quick example. We design buildings regardless of who lives in that building. If it's a person who doesn't have much money or a person who has a lot of money, doesn't matter, right? At the end of the day, the code is the same. But we have looked into the idea of how social vulnerability actually has an impact on the performance of the building under extreme event. So take, for example, a building that is occupied by a single mother. She doesn't have much money. She doesn't have, she lives near maybe forested area. She doesn't have money to upgrade her home. She's renting, so she doesn't have really a lot of interest in investing in that home anyway. The likelihood of that building getting damaged in an event is actually much higher than a building that is occupied by someone who has a lot of money and owns the building and so on. The building code doesn't take that into account. It's not in there. We actually, I mean, it's not like we're guessing. We actually developed an artificial intelligence. We used AI. We trained a lot of data, and we found that these social characteristics have a lot of impact on damage. So, so it's interesting. So we have to look at things from a different angle sometimes to be able to come up with solutions, spin in the right direction, to benefit the marginalized communities, but also everybody in the community will benefit. So,
Really interesting. Michael, anything you want to add? Okay. Well, we're right at time, so I want to thank you all so much for being here today. I'd like to thank the Climate Registry for hosting this event and our panelists for their time and insights. And as we close, I'd just like to take the chance for each of you to have like a last word about how you're feeling or just a thought you'd like to leave the audience with today. So Michael, we'll start with you.
Optimistic at the end of this, coming to the end of this COP, that there's a lot of people doing a lot of good things here. We have a ways to go, but there's a lot of people doing good work.
Yeah, let me riff on that. So I tell people I'm a climate realist, which means I'm a climate optimist. And I am very hopeful. And I think because of the work that the scientific community, the engineering community is doing, we can look to the publics around the world and say, we got your back.
how could I be pessimistic if I have two people optimistic? I mean, you give me no choice. I am also optimistic, obviously, but I am sincerely optimistic. I think we're heading in the right direction. I sometimes wonder if we're stuck in a loop, right? We keep coming to conferences and present and so on. But I feel also when I come to a gathering like this where everybody cares about the same thing, I feel, and I hear wonderful remarks and what people are doing, I feel like we're heading in the right direction. We do have long ways to go, but I'm confident we'll get there.
Okay. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.